For those of you who do not know me, my name is Sarah Brown, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, otherwise known by our acronym, which is CHANGE with 2 H's. Before I continue, I want to note that our center is housed on the occupied territory of the Lenni Lenape people. Now, for those of you who are new to CHANGE, welcome. Our center has worked for the past 42 years to promote the elimination of racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of prejudice through innovative education about the Holocaust, other instances of genocide, including the Armenian Genocide and human rights. While we remain virtual with respect to our programming this fall, our center is partially open. And so if anyone is interested in touring our permanent exhibit, Journeys Beyond Genocide, The Human Experience, which features the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, and the genocide against the Tutsi, or is interested in learning more about our archives, which are the only in the state dedicated to Holocaust and genocide topics, or even perusing our 6,000 volume library, please, you are most welcome. We would love to have you come in. So reach out and we will arrange a visit. And also visit our website, www.change.org. Again, that's change with 2 H's, in order to learn more or to view our available resources to support virtual and in-person learning and teaching. Now, today, our featured speaker is going to talk about an oft ignored topic, resistance during the Armenian Genocide. Dr. Mouradian weaves together this fascinating and well-researched tapestry that details a network of resistors, rescuers, and bravery that challenge the depictions of Armenians as passive victims of genocide. So to everyone who is here tonight to learn with us and from Dr. Mouradian, thank you. Change programming occurs because of the generosity of our members and program participants like you. Please consider joining Change as a member or contributing to support this and future programming. And again, to join, please visit change.org, change with 2 H's.org. Now, after this session, you will receive an email of additional resources, as well as a link to watch a recording of this program. In addition, for the next 48 hours, you will have an opportunity to purchase the book, and you will get a signed copy from Dr. Mouradian if you do so. Now, a couple of quick housekeeping items, and then I get to hand things over to Dr. Mouradian. First, your audio will remain muted throughout the program, but the chat feature is enabled. So please feel free to communicate with one another, and feel free to also use that chat feature. And this is point number 2. At the end of the presentation, use that chat feature to type in any questions you may have for Dr. Mouradian. And at the end of his presentation, we will get to as many as possible. I would also like to thank Change staff, Spencer Cronin and Allie Evans, for making tonight's program possible, and a very special thank you to Dr. Mouradian for joining us tonight. A little bit about our guest speaker. Dr. Mouradian is a lecturer at Columbia University and the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress. He is the author of The Resistance Network, The Armenian Genocide and Humanitarianism in Ottoman Syria, 1915 to 1918. And in 2020, Mouradian was awarded a Humanities War and Peace Initiative grant from Columbia University. He has published articles on concentration camps, unarmed resistance, the aftermath of mass violence, midwifery in the Middle East, and approaches to teaching history. He is the co-editor of a forthcoming book on late Ottoman history and the editor of the peer-reviewed journal, The Armenian Review. Previously, Mouradian taught at Worcester State University, Clark University, Stockton University, Rutgers University, and California State University, Fresno. Please join me in welcoming him tonight, to speak with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I have to say that this is a special event for me for a number of reasons. One being that, of course, this is clearly not the first time that I interact with the Change audience and community, and it's wonderful for all of you to be here. Second is that any event that my colleague and friend Sarah puts together is an event that is special. So there is that as well. We're both graduates from the PhD program at the Strasser Center. And I think that is itself a bond that connects many of us who are from that program around the globe. But most importantly, I have to say that today marks the first time in perhaps at this point 25 Zoom talks that I have done on this book, where the families and descendants of one of the central figures in the book, one of the central members of these group of individuals who organize to fight back and save Armenians during the Armenian Genocide in Aleppo and the region, and her descendants, as well as descendants of a doctor who is also featured in the book and actually saved her life, are both here. And that is, I'll say a little bit more about that in a little later. One of the blessings of these events, virtual events that I have been doing since January, is that I have had the opportunity to connect with, I would say, a few hundred people who are descendants of individuals that I speak about in this book. And in many ways, it has been a humbling, moving experience when, I have, when I share their stories and in a way tell their stories with a lens and perspective that weaves them together and thinks about this experience as one that uplifts and upholds both the voices of Armenians who were targeted for destruction, as well as the actions, as we shall see, of Armenians who were expected to be deported and die like sheep, and often who were portrayed as being deported and dying like sheep. So as such, again, this is, this will be another opportunity for me to speak in the presence of a number of descendants of some of the central figures in this book, and do that in this special venue. And this is, I have to say, perhaps one of the central motivating factors for me to write this book in the first place. When we start researching, when we start delving into projects such as this, particularly about an area, a region, or an aspect of research history that we are not very familiar with, and the scholarship has not really tackled in a way that sheds light on what transpired in a particular region that we're covering, that it's quite challenging to make sense of things. And this was certainly true with my own experience as I started researching the region that we are looking at today. Just to give everybody a little sense of the area that I'm talking about here. So the region that I cover is sort of a triangle between what is the city of Aleppo, what was and still is, the region of Ras Al Ain on the right of your screen, and there is Zor towards the bottom of the screen. This triangle in many ways becomes one of the most fateful and deadliest and darkest corners of the Armenian Genocide by the summer of 1916. So, and one of the things that prompted me to engage in this particular research is precisely that. I had grown up hearing stories about Deir ez-Zor. I had grown up hearing Deir ez-Zor be used as a synonym for the Armenian Genocide. But for a place that had that kind of prominence in Armenian history and in the history of the Armenian Genocide, and this may be true for many of you here who may have connections to the destruction of the Armenian population in World War I. It was baffling to me how little there is that tackles precisely what happened in that very same region, right? The Armenian genocide is the second best studied case of genocide after the Holocaust. So one would imagine that, the region that is supposed to be often referred to as the ground zero of the Armenian genocide, as the Auschwitz of the Armenian genocide, would have received that kind of prominent attention, but it had not. So I embarked on this project with the aim of telling the story, understanding the dynamics and the processes and orders that led to the massacres of Deir ez-Zor in December 1916. Perhaps months after, many of the survivors of the Armenian genocide had thought the worst is over. And as I embarked in this project, I found myself again in this confused region where there's very little sources, very difficult to access many of these materials. There's a language barrier, there's the barriers of politics and genocide denial, all of which had become a hindrance in the past. As I tried to make sense and put the pieces together, something different also emerged. From the corner that was supposed to be the darkest and the deadliest of the Armenian genocide, something became very clear to me, that this was also one of the places from where thousands, if not tens of thousands, survived and formed the foundation of the rebuilding of the Armenian nation. Precisely because Armenians did not go to their death like sheep. And this realization came about largely by looking at the stories and accounts of the survivors, or the letters, minutes, correspondence that those who did not survive had left behind. And in doing so, reading a lot of accounts and memoirs and diaries of survivors. Now, it's not surprising when we are studying any case of mass violence or genocide to read and encounter cases of resistance, cases of resilience, cases of people trying to push back against the authorities, to try to thwart the destruction of their group, of their families, etc. So that was to be expected, right? The interesting aspect here for me as I read more and more about this, and I started connecting individuals with one another, as certain names started recurring, as one individual connected me to the other. And as I started literally mapping these names and their connections, something fascinating emerged. These people, many of these people, were not just involved in actions against the will of the authorities, against the sanction of the authorities in order to save fellow Armenians, but they were in fact doing that. Hundreds of these Armenians and locals, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and as well as foreign missionaries and diplomats, they were so not only engaged in saving Armenians and resisting the perpetrators, but they were doing so in a way that connected them quite intimately, and in a way that instead of a group of individuals, ultimately what emerged in my research was a network of people. A network that was not an organization in any sense of the word, but certainly very organized. A network of people who were connected, sometimes very closely and strongly, sometimes very loosely, but they all realized the power and the impact of that connection was doing. And in many ways, this perception eventually led me to, and the realization eventually led me to title the book The Resistance Network. And this was a process that went on for years. In fact, as the book was in the final phases of production, I had a different title for it. the title was sort of a version of the subtitle. And at some point, it became clear that I cannot call it anything but the Resistance Network. For a few reasons, including the fact that, one of the reasons why this effort was so successful in saving as many lives that it did in the darkest corners of the Armenian genocide is that this was not led by one individual or a number of individuals. You had several hundreds of people who were often engaged in this and relied on each other. Those who were burnt out, exhausted, killed, arrested, were replaced by others who continued their work. And therefore, the network was more important than its individual members. And this was essentially at the core something very different. One of the quotes that I have in the beginning of the book, I have two quotes in the beginning. One is from Margaret Atwood from The Handmaid's Tale that says, "I believe in the resistance as I believe there can be no light without shadow, or rather no shadow unless there is also light." The second one is from a book about trees and research about the connections of the roots of trees and the networks there. It's from a book called Underland, A Deep Time Journey. And the quote is, "You look at the network and then it starts to look back at you." So I was looking at these hundreds of individuals, their stories, and connecting them. And at some point, I stopped seeing them as individuals and this connection emerged. So I was looking at the network, and at some point, the network looked back at me. And so this is that story. That is the story that I'm going to be telling today. And this is going to be the foundation of some of the central arguments that I'm going to be making, at least some of the central arguments I'm going to be making today in the remaining time that I have. So let me move to the image that graces the cover of the book. Now, after this little segment, I will give a very quick overview of the Armenian genocide, the 1-minute version of it. I always fail to limit it to 1 minute, but I will try again. But let me start with this image. A few weeks back, I was in a Zoom conversation with the Shirajian family, the family of Reverend Aharon Shirajian, whose picture graces the cover of the book. He is the man in the middle. There are two central figures in this photograph: Nora Altunian, whose name is constantly comes up in the book for her tremendous role in saving thousands of orphans, and Aharon Shirajian, again, for the same reason, as well as many other significant actions and roles that he plays in his entire lifetime. And Aharon Shirajian's daughter, I had the opportunity to speak to over Zoom. She's in her 90s. And in one of perhaps the most moving moments of me talking about this book or listening to stories about this book, I was having a conversation with Aharon Shirajian's daughter and for other family members, and she pulled out, she brought to the screen a photograph that she has hanging on the wall in her house of her father, which is precisely this photograph that I accessed from the HBU Nubar Library in Paris, and ultimately decided that would be a very, in its symbolism, in its representation, a very apt image for this book. Because first, it demonstrates a group of people and emphasizes this idea of a collective effort. Second, it does not have any horsemen, or weapons, in the picture. And third, you have men and women and children. So you have a diverse group of people who all look very deliberate. The picture is they are all pausing and posing, but it's in a sense also a picture that has so much energy in terms of it almost feels like something is about to happen, right? And in that, for that reason, I absolutely connected with this photograph, and it ended up being on the cover of the book. Now, what do these individuals represent? In many ways, the 1-minute description of what happened during the Armenian Genocide would be under the cover of World War I. The Ottoman Turkish authorities planned the destruction, the deportation, dispossession, and destruction of the empire's Armenian, in addition to Assyrian and Greek communities, with the intention of solving once and for all the problems related to what was referred to as the Eastern Question, what was referred to as the constant Armenian problem in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians asking for rights, for equal rights, for government protection against attacks that they were being subjected to over decades, from massacres and pogroms. And essentially, the cover of World War I was used for the Ottoman Turkish authorities to attempt to once and for all empty what they perceived to be the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, but what was for the Armenians their ancestral homeland, of its Armenian population, and deport them and massacre them, and once and for all be done with this, with what was referred to as the Armenian issue, Armenian problem, right? So, and this is precisely what they do. And you have, in the beginning in April 1915, and in subsequent months, you have Armenian intellectuals being arrested in Constantinople, the capital, as well as across the Ottoman Empire in major cities. You have Armenian leaders, religious figures who are arrested. April 24, in fact, which is Armenian Genocide Commemoration Day, marks the time when, essentially the day when these arrests of Armenian intellectuals and leaders started in Constantinople. Among the Armenian intellectuals and leaders who were arrested and are in fact on the list of arrested individuals, but will eventually survive, is a doctor by the name of Khatchig Mouradian. I remember that name, hold that name. And so, and he makes the list of the first 30, 40 top intellectuals who were arrested, over and over again in historical accounts. At the same time, you have these orders to deport the Armenian population. Most Armenians are going to be told that they're going to be resettled, and this is a temporary deportation. But ultimately, the intention is to actually settle them under the sand of the desert. In fact, what is referred to and often cited in the deportation orders as the destination for these deportees is in the middle of the desert. It is a desert area in Ottoman Syria, which, the region that I just showed on the map. And that is where those who survive the first rounds of massacres and deportations end up largely in concentration camps, but also many of them in cities and small towns in that entire region. So what happens, however, is that by September, October 1915, so within a few months, the Ottoman Empire, the heartland of the Ottoman Empire, which is also, as I said, the heart of the Armenian homeland, was almost entirely emptied of its Armenian population. And those who were deported from their homes were overwhelmingly largely massacred. historian Raymond Kevorkian, who alongside Deborah Dwork and Taner Akçam were on my dissertation committee. Historian Raymond Kevorkian estimates that around 800,000 Armenians had already been killed in this initial round of deportations, massacres, deprivation, and hunger. But that still meant that hundreds of thousands of others made it to the region that I'm talking about, as well as some of the coastal areas, fewer numbers, and other areas in Ottoman Syria. What happens to these people? Many of these people are placed in concentration camps. And this is the focus of the second half of my book. And beginning in the summer and fall of 1915, all the way into the spring and summer of 1916, sometimes for months, in these concentration camps, you have people dying of hunger, starvation, and exposure, and some violence. Month after month after month, you have essentially the decimation of the population that was already destroyed in the initial rounds of massacres, and now whoever had survived is dying in these camps. In some cases, there are instances in the Meskene concentration camp, for example, where you have in one day around, there are certain weeks where every single day around 500 people are dying. Still, this is not just about people dying or waiting for their death. There is this effort to organize, help each other, and try to fight back without often firing a single bullet in order to survive and save lives. The history of the Armenian genocide, the 1-minute history, the 10-minute history, the often volumes of books that have been written on this, tend to portray Armenians in general, on the one hand, as on the receiving end of violence and massacre, right? So on the one hand, on the receiving end of genocide from the Turkish authorities, and on the other, on the receiving end of Western charity and humanitarianism. So, and what this book does in, one of the main issues I tackle in this book is that essentially removing Armenians from this position of either being subject to violence or being subject to humanitarianism, and actually talk about their own role and agency, and in particular, their efforts in organizing against genocide, and in organizing and becoming a central part of these humanitarian relief efforts that are occurring in the region. Scholarship has compellingly demonstrated that the Armenian experience is the period when humanitarianism, Western humanitarianism in the Middle East is emerging. This is a period where you have only in the United States today's equivalent of a couple $2 billion raised for assisting Armenians during the genocide, and even more so in the aftermath. And but one thing that I demonstrate in this book is that these funds were not just, while the genocide was unfolding, these funds were not just coming into the Ottoman Empire, and missionaries and consuls were not just walking around and distributing money. None of that was even remotely possible. The Armenians were an integral part of a network that was clandestinely, secretly taking the money from the consuls or the missionaries. And then, you have these couriers and other figures who are essentially risking their lives to go into these concentration camps that I referred to in secret and distribute funds, distribute medication, and so on. So in that sense, the history of the Armenian genocide is a history of destruction, is a history of massacres and death. If anything, the history of the region that I'm covering is primarily the history of death and destruction. But ultimately, it is also a history of resilience, and organized efforts to resist this, even in the absence of the possibility of fighting back with weapons. And in this, once we broaden our thinking and definition of what constitutes genocide, something that has occurred in Holocaust scholarship decades ago, we realize that, of course, we're also broadening the role and our understanding and appreciation of the role that not just a group of men who had access to weapons and training in weapons played, but also the role of those who had no access to guns, had no interest in firing bullets, or also women who would oftentimes, in any narrative of armed resistance, would be pushed, to the margin, or at least play a supporting role. Their roles, their contributions emerges. And here I want to give another name to illustrate the point. Elma Santorian found herself in a privileged position after a months-long ordeal of deportation and illness during the Armenian Genocide. She was a nurse by training, and she was deported from her hometown of Marash. She got typhus soon after she arrived and found shelter in Aleppo. Again, one of the first half of the book focuses on Aleppo. And she recovered from typhus with the help of an Armenian doctor, whom she happened to know from Constantinople when she was getting her training as a nurse, receiving her training as a nurse. And that doctor's name was none other than Khatchig Mouradian, who was himself a deportee at this point. He had survived the arrest and the killings of the intellectuals that began on April 24, had made it to Aleppo, and had also become an integral part of this network that was trying to save as many Armenians as possible. So Elma Santorian's story fascinates me for a number of reasons. One, she is the product of an earlier case of mass violence against Armenians, right? She and in her account, which is also recounted by her son, she tells of how she was a massacre widow. She survives the massacre, but her husband does not. As I mentioned earlier, there are several waves of violence against Armenians before the Armenian Genocide. So this is we are talking about a period in the aftermath around 1909, what is referred to as the Adana massacres. So she survives these massacres and loses her husband, has children, and decides that she does not want to be to go the route where her husband's brothers and family in general would support them, and she would be in this, again, passive state of receiving support from the husband's family, which was the traditionally accepted form of moving on anyway. So she decides to leave her children with her family, with her husband's family, and go to Constantinople to get a training as a nurse and come back and essentially be able to support her children. She does precisely that. Goes to Constantinople. That's where, as she's receiving her training, she meets Dr. Khatchig Mouradian as well. And she completes her training in the Imperial School of Nursing, returns to her hometown, and a couple months later, World War I begins. And then you have deportation. And then you have Elmas arriving in Aleppo and getting typhus, a deadly disease that, as I document in the book extensively, was the reason for the death of tens of thousands of Armenians in the region, as well as tens of thousands of others in the region, Arabs, Muslims, essentially whoever was living in those areas, there were certain regions where the disease essentially spreads and kills everyone in many villages and towns. Sometimes this disease essentially arrives in some parts of the region that we're talking about with the Armenian deportees. And this becomes an additional reason for the resentment and anger against Armenians, as if they were, right, the cause of what was going on to them and to everybody else, right? And it was not the policies of the central authorities. So this is a disease that Elma Santorian survives, thanks in part to the assistance she receives from Dr. Khatchig Mouradian. And then now she suddenly has the superpower of having immunity to a disease that's wreaking havoc, and also having training as a nurse. And therefore her training, her connection with Khatchig Mouradian, who is himself a deportee, as I mentioned, and her newly acquired immunity to typhus, and a smattering of good fortune help her become the head nurse of an Ottoman military hospital in Aleppo, the Vatan Hospital Network, as the Armenian Genocide raged on. And so what she does is, and here in her own words, she says she uses her position as head nurse. And I can say more about how an Armenian ends up becoming the head nurse. She saves the life of the daughter of a prominent military figure, taking care of her. This Ottoman Turkish officer's daughter had typhus. And so she uses her new position to hire, and I'm quoting her here, Armenian refugee girls, some orphaned, but all hiding from the gendarmes. I secured their work papers, which exempted them and their families from deportation and certain death, end quote. And in this way, she helped save hundreds of lives. But if you look closely to her role, as well as the role of Khatchig Mouradian and others that I document in the book, many of these individuals were not just doing this work as individuals. They relied heavily on assistance from other members of this network of Western missionaries and diplomats, Armenian actors, community leaders, volunteers, couriers, as well as local Muslims and Jews and other Christians, right? And so perhaps this is a point where I take 30 seconds to mention that the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Khatchig Mouradian are here, several of them. And family members of Elma Santorian are also here. Some members of the family, the Santorian family also is an extensive family. And so it is a privilege to tell this story and talk about this book in this context. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can get more into that aspect and maybe even hear from some of you. Now, let me proceed to give you a sense of the scope of this effort in the next 6 to 7 minutes, and then open it up for discussion. This is an image of several central figures of what I refer to as the resistance network. Initially, they form committees and are openly trying to organize and save Armenians, deportees who are arriving in the region, beginning in May 1915. There's an Armenian Catholic Church, Evangelical Church, and Apostolic Church in Aleppo. In fact, in some cases, more than one. And each church, each congregation forms committees and engages in efforts to help the deportees as they are arriving. And I document that at length in the book. Several members that you see in this picture actually are members of the Armenian Apostolic Church who are involved in this process, in this project. One of the important sources that I used are the minutes of this committee formed by the Armenian Church in Aleppo. On the right side, you'll see an example of the minutes. So every single day, members of this committee that is formed will gather, meet, decide the next steps that they're going to take in terms of fundraising, in terms of preparing lists and assistance, in terms of bribing officials, you name it, right? In order to save as many lives as possible. This is like really, I keep referring to the fact that this is like really having a real feed, right? Video recording of what is going on in Aleppo in these early months of deportation. This is another document from a treasure trove of hundreds of documents and minutes and the receipts from the Armenian the archives of the Armenian Apostolic Church in Aleppo. And these are lists of deportees. With the town they're coming from, here you have Zeytun and Hassan Beyli, and you have the head of the family, the name of the head of the family, how many men and women in each family in total, when they arrived, the date of arrival, and this is all, and which camp they are in. And this helps people, just helps the committee and community organize assistance efforts. And these are receipts from, we have accounts and ledgers of every single egg, every single piece of wood, every little bribe that is paid and purchased is listed in these ledgers throughout the entire war. So you see how using the sources of the targeted group, using the Armenian language sources, how it enriches our understanding, and not just allows us to give, to essentially listen to and amplify the voices of those who are targeted, but actually helps us do good history, write history in a way that tries to incorporate and tell in an integrated manner, the entire process. This is one of the central locations where a lot happens in the resistance network. It is the Hotel Baron, very well known for a number of reasons, be it from the fact that leading political figures, political leaders, its connection to Agatha Christie, a number of prominent figures will stay in this hotel in the aftermath of the genocide and in the decades since. And the two brothers who ran this hotel played a significant role in the resistance network. Their names are the Mausoleumian Brothers, and again, they're central in the book. This is another key figure in the resistance network, Reverend Eskijian, and his example demonstrates the risks that people went into as they were trying to resist the Ottoman Turkish authorities' efforts to destroy the Armenian population. I say to resist because what they were doing was not just charity and humanitarianism and assistance or mutual help. They were doing this in a time and a place where doing so was against the law. They were doing this in a situation where assisting Armenians was not something that was tolerated, was not something that was allowed. And they often, many of the members of this group either died, and Reverend Eskijian is an example of that. He contracted typhus from the deportees he was helping and died in early 1916. So he was part of this effort just for a few months. Yet he played a critical role in this early period, and his legacy lives on. There is a museum named after Eskijian in California, the Arad Eskijian Museum, and his wife, other members of his group and entourage, including several teenagers who ended up writing moving memoirs about their experience, all were played a key role in this resistance network. And this resistance network extended into concentration camps along the Euphrates River that are at the core of what I explore in the book, how life was in these camps, how death was in these camps, but also ultimately how people tried to organize, connect with one another, and save as many lives as possible. Here you have sketches of maps by Alba Mandonian, who actually went through this system, and he kept meticulous records of this, and the map as well is prepared by Mandonian. Here you have samples of the camp director's handwriting of the Meskene camp director, essentially estimating how many Armenians died in the camp of Meskene, around 80,000, right? Just in one camp. And on the left side, you have a newspaper, a handwritten newspaper that was prepared in Meskene and passed from person to person as people organized and tried to learn what is going on in order to better essentially engage in efforts to thwart the attempts for their destruction. Ultimately, though, much of this does end helping save thousands of lives. This effort is tremendously successful in that regard. But it's important to realize that the lives that are saved are just a fraction of the total number of Armenians who were in this region. Beginning in March 1916 and culminating in the summer of 1916, there is a second order that arrives in the region to shut down the concentration camps, push the population, those who have survived those deadly months of starvation, disease, and exposure, in the direction of Deir ez-Zor, this town in the corners, in the edges of the Ottoman Empire, and start a second decisive round of massacres. Anywhere between 250,000 to, according to some estimates, up to 300,000, 400,000 Armenians are killed in the Deir ez-Zor massacres. And this is, again, the site is the place of the deadliest corners of the Armenian genocide and the deadliest massacres, hands down the deadliest massacre of the Armenian genocide. And this is largely concludes the aspect of mass violence in this period in 1915-16 that really constitutes the core of the Armenian genocide. Now, 100 years later, these are images that I took when I visited Syria, Deir ez-Zor, right before the war began. And they had just discovered a new mass grave, building a school, and they noticed that it's another mass grave. There are dozens of such mass graves in Syria that are known. And therefore, they built a school next to it. And this mound that you see here, this hill, which is essentially that mass grave, had become the playground for the children who go to that school. And this is a photograph that has haunted me in the decade since I took it. These were children that, as we were scratching the surface of the sand and bones were coming out, pieces of bones and pieces of skulls, these kids they too started bringing bones to us. And when we asked them, what are these? They said, Armeni, Armenians. And I took this picture, and in recent months, over and over again, I've shown this image in just one way to connect the past with the present and speak about the layers of violence in this region and say, I wonder what happened to these children. And this was a rhetorical question a lot of times. I was just putting it out there. I wonder which camp they ended up in, which refugee camp they are in Europe, around the Middle East. I wonder who's telling their stories, who is standing and documenting their resilience, their efforts to organize and help themselves. I wonder how good of a job we are doing compared to what people did 3 generations, 4 generations ago with the Armenian experience. And as I asked these questions, right, I had no idea that just, again, during a few days after one such event, a person reached out to me from Syria on Facebook and told me that the boy with the white t-shirt who's in the front of the photograph had actually died during the war in Syria. And perhaps this is as good a place as any to stop and reflect on this experience, this journey, and hear your questions and comments. Thank you very much.
I think I needed a minute to recover, so Khatchig, thank you so much for just a really for taking us on this journey with you, and also unpacking with us how you were looking at the forest and then the forest looked back at you, and how you realized that you had uncovered this tremendous network. I actually have a personal question, but I do want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat and we'll get to as many as we can. And my question for you, and this is very much borrowing from the fact that we were both in the same program and benefited from just tremendous mentors who employ very rigorous methodological approaches to their research. I'm just curious, how did you embark on this? This seems like a massive endeavor in multiple languages, incorporating primary source materials that I'm guessing many have not had access to. So how did you go about just amassing this treasure trove of research and weaving this tapestry together, finding the network?
Well, a number of things, right? One, I was fortunate. Let me put that out there. It helps. One of the things was that as I was doing this work and the research, I was also, very much involved in the Armenian community. I was the editor of a newspaper. I did visit different communities, give talks, etc. And this is a part of me being fortunate, because every time I tell a story, somebody will say, "Oh, well, my grandfather, my grandmother, etc." Right? And anybody who starts a sentence with my grandfather or grandmother, I never stop them, and I listen, right? And that's important. And I ask them if they have any resources and sources, etc. I was also fortunate to have access to certain documents that I have access to right now that even just over the last decade has become even more difficult to access. But also, again, I was fortunate because, again, the network looked back at me. And that, yes, to a certain extent is because I was, in the beginning, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And then eventually, as I pieced things together, it became clearer, but also because, again, a lot of these different archives and different sources, and my curiosity about people and their stories and their connections suddenly made all of this possible. And yes, you're right. I believe both of us do share one advisor at least. And I was fortunate to have, arguably, or perhaps beyond dispute, the two top historians of the Armenian Genocide who were my advisors, and a top Holocaust scholar who was my co-advisor alongside Taner Akçam, the board at work. And that was a source of inspiration, guidance. Each member of my committee brought a different set of skills and thinking, and all of this came together. But ultimately, I think I would say this book is built on the shoulders of survivors who told their stories. And I never lose sight of that. And that's why in the beginning of this conversation, I said, one of the reasons why I really feel very honored tonight is because members from two different families who are connected and enmeshed with the story of this book are actually here tonight. Particular big hello to Silva Bogosian, by the way, the granddaughter of Khatchig Mouradian, who's an active member of the Change Committee as well. So, other questions?
We have a bunch. Can you estimate, do you have any estimate, this was sent to me as a private message, can you estimate how many people survived as a result of these rescue efforts?
It's difficult because, of course, I don't want to give numbers about thousands, many thousands who survived, because, of course, you have different factors that are contributing to their survival, right? So there's that. And importantly, they themselves are part of the efforts that are contributing to their own survival. So I don't want to take away that aspect either. But I would comfortably say that we are talking in this region, between Aleppo, Ras Al Ain, and Deir ez-Zor, which is the focus of the book, and which is where the majority of Armenians who survived the first round arrived. In this region, I would put the number in the tens of thousands.
How is it, and this segues into the next question so comfortably, how is it that they were able to the network, many of whom are, especially vulnerable because they too are Armenians who would be targeted for annihilation? How is it that they were able to escape discovery, especially since there were so many who were assisting in the perpetration of the genocide and uncovering Armenians and fighting back, I would assume, against resistors, armed or otherwise?
And I would add one more thing to this. These people had no idea what language people were talking. They are coming from regions that are predominantly Turkish speaking, right? And they are in a region that is predominantly Arabic speaking. And the fact that you have one day deportee and targeted for genocide, the other day turns into resistor. And again, many of these people are like that. Armenian Genocide is a perfect case. This is a guy who, himself was a deportee and suddenly becomes one of the central figures of this effort. And others, Khatchig Mouradian, same thing. We remember and commemorate Khatchig Mouradian as one of the intellectuals who were arrested on April 24, which is the date for the beginning of the Armenian genocide and a symbol for genocide and death. But Khatchig Mouradian has another life, and is a life of resilience and resistance and organizing and connecting in Aleppo, right? So this is a tremendous effort. Many people are not successful. Many people, in fact, are so not successful that their children and grandchildren cannot join us during Zoom meetings. There are several people who serve as messengers who actually died along the road or were arrested and killed, etc. And in one case, I only know his first name, and I mentioned it in the book. These are people whose stories are so whatever we have here are the stories of those who survived or of those who left some kind of account behind that survived in turn. And yes, the challenges were large. Some people were able to navigate this space where they could work with the authorities who found them important in the war effort, and at the same time secretly, clandestinely assist the Armenians. Some of the names that I mentioned actually were in that category, but even those were not protected. Even those will eventually be exiled. The brothers that I mentioned of the hotel, Baron Hotel, where the top leadership of the Ottoman Empire stayed, actually were exiled in 1916, largely because of their efforts in the network, just to give one example.
Another question, what is the best way to access information about residents of Aleppo during the time of the genocide? And just by way of background, my father was born there in 1905 and left for the United States in late 1920. I am the nephew of Dr. Boghossian.
So if you are related to Dr. Boghossian, as far as Dr. Boghossian's life is concerned, you are actually fortunate, because there's a lot about him, because again, he has a very rich history during and the aftermath of the genocide. He plays a critical role in the rebuilding of the Armenian community in Syria after the genocide. Several members and figures in this book who survived that effort are central figures in starting hospitals in the city. The first Armenian hospital, the first a number of centers, establishments, schools, helping develop entire neighborhoods to move Armenian refugees from camps into neighborhoods that are today, still to this day, centers of thriving communities in places in different parts of Syria, including Aleppo. All of these are often done by the same people. There are several sources, to be very quick in this very brief time. You can use baptism records in Aleppo that's more accessible and hasn't been destroyed the way it has been in other places. You can use government papers, official papers, memoirs and accounts are a treasure trove. Khatchig Mouradian, again, you're fortunate because you will encounter his name in probably several dozen memoirs, right? Of course, language may be a barrier, but even that, beyond that, it's still possible to find a lot of information. And of course, for those who end up in the United States, there's another wealth of additional information through ship manifests, other documents, etc.
I'm sitting and thinking on this idea of agency and action and the myriad forms of resistance that you detail as part of this network's actions, but also this idea of Armenians facing very dire circumstances in these camps, even organizing, resisting, finding ways to survive, finding ways to communicate, documenting through these handwritten newspapers. I'm curious, and this is something that I encountered a lot with my own research. Is this narrative known amongst Armenians, but just has not been shared outside of the Armenian community? Or was this actually news to many of the Armenians who you were working with and sharing this knowledge with?
That's an excellent question. In fact, many Armenians think of, they know about, some of them will know about the efforts of their own family members. Oftentimes the Armenian community itself, didn't think much of these because, well, they're Armenians, they're supposed to do things. But, that was the thinking. So that's one. So even though the network is not something that was known, right? The efforts of the individuals was certainly known. In fact, other networks that existed, particularly one that smuggled information out of the country, was known to certain circles because and did operate in Istanbul, primarily out of Istanbul. But there's another element too. We in the Armenian community, there is this effort to, and denial plays a role in this, to emphasize the role of the non-Armenian missionaries, the diplomats and the missionaries. Henry Morgenthau, many of the others prominent missionaries and diplomats who played a key role in helping Armenians during the genocide, or Near East Relief and others. And when there was reason for that emphasis, right? Because when talking to non-Armenians in many countries in Europe and the United States and making the case for genocide recognition in the face of the Turkish state's denial, that was a way in. That was a way in which you tell your story, right? Talking about Ottoman Syria or Elma Santorian, right, wasn't going to connect with people as much as, unfortunately, talking about, say, someone who may have been a descendant of, right, or some figures that played a key role in the women's suffrage movement in the United States, etc. So that is the connection. You read The Burning Tigress by Peter Balakian. You read the work by scholars, like groundbreaking work on humanitarianism by scholars like Keith Wattenpaugh and others. And yes, many of these actors play a critical role, but the voices and the stories of those key intermediaries, largely Armenian, are either anecdotally, scattered around among families, private papers, memoirs, and diaries, or just not really celebrated. Even when Armenians do celebrate things, these are celebrations of cases of armed resistance. The 40 Days of Musadab being one prominent case.
We see that actually across other examples as well. We see this with, the Warsaw Uprising, for example, when studying the Holocaust, and there's also, it's Bisacero, the armed resistance that happens also in Rwanda. So that's a familiar narrative, a familiar refrain. We have one person who asks, actually bringing it up to current events. You mentioned towards the end of your talk that you're concerned about the job we are doing in telling the modern stories of struggling to survive in camps in dire circumstances, and the stories of those young boys who you photographed in Syria. How would you recommend that we acquire and share those stories? What is our role here?
I think that our role, it's often for communities, particularly communities that have this kind of long shadow of genocide still cast over them, right? And its denial and its consequences. The war in Artsakh last year was a very palpable moment that underscores that. A state that has acknowledged the Armenian genocide, made amends, made reparations, would not engage in that war the way Turkey did a year ago, right? So that's one. In a situation such as that, we often forget, right, that this was a similar situation to the situation that many non-Armenians found themselves more than 100 years ago. They had their own challenges. They had their own issues. It was World War I, right? And still many did mobilize and engage and help. So that's one critical general point to make. And I do think that in today's ever-connected world, where suffering and massacres and violence in one place, and the refugee crisis in one place is a refugee crisis and suffering in a lot of places. We even have a greater responsibility to be engaged. Engage and active in forging connections and solidarities, right? As we push for and struggle for justice. The struggle for justice, I believe, is also connected and interconnected these days, and there's strength in that kind of numbers and those kinds of alliances. So that's key. And I do think that, and I got yesterday I teach my classes on Tuesdays at Columbia, and at some point I got a little emotional because because I was talking about this. In fact, it just happened that we're covering the Armenian Genocide right now. And when we think about what we are doing, I mean, the fact that I was standing in front of those students yesterday, right, as the grandson of child survivors of the Armenian Genocide, and was a powerful moment that I sort of wanted to point them to, saying that what we do today will determine 2 generations from now if these kids and their children and their grandchildren are going to be resilient, are going to be able to rebuild their lives, and at some point their grandchildren will be able to stand up in front of an audience and tell their story, right? So our actions, our inaction will cast another shadow for another century. Something that we are not necessarily mindful or cognizant of as we go about doing our business, our everyday lives, right? So I do think there's much that can be done. There's of course much that can be done when targeted communities continue to be targeted. But that one way to break free from that is also thinking about this in a way that sort of follows this tradition of coming together of Western missionaries and locals and others, and also thinking about people who are being targeted, not as individuals that we're supposed to meet and tell them what to do, but people we're supposed to stand next to and take guidance from as to how best we can work together in order to help their efforts, instead of telling the story as if we saved them, we are the saviors, they are the victims, and there's some kind of perpetrator somewhere else.
That's an excellent call to action, and for standing up for human rights wherever they're being threatened and abused. I want to close actually with a final thought, and this is one, I'm going to put you on the spot, that in April, the United States president finally acknowledged the Armenian genocide. And it's been a very long journey. It's been a long time coming. And we at Change are very proud of the role that we played actually in facilitating the floor debate that happened in the House of Representatives, which eventually made its way to the Senate and now gave the political cover for what happened on April 24th. Has it moved the needle? Has it done something in terms of combating denial of the Armenian genocide? And also with that denial, I think a great point that you made is no country that acknowledged and made reparations for a genocide it perpetrated would then go and participate in such a violent act of aggression over 100 years later. I'm just curious, where do we stand? Has it facilitated any type of progress? Are we going to see maybe some dividends from this?
Thank you for the question. I do think that the needle has moved, no question, for a number of reasons, a number of ways. Often there are several important actors in global politics and diplomacy and major countries, etc., who had not taken this step of acknowledging the Armenian genocide. And the United States clearly was one of them, right? And that acknowledgement has both consequences domestically, because many court cases that were being filed were often, sometimes, in fact, the fact that there's no federal recognition of the crime was used as a reason for the cases to be dropped or thrown out. And therefore, that's one local manifestation, right? The other is that once the United States has this recognition, it's a more meaningful commemoration and a more meaningful engagement with this act of acknowledgement is worth pursuing and is being hopefully pursued. And this is important, right? But there's also an international element to this, right? Many countries, in fact, the Biden administration's recognition, and then before that, of course, the resolutions in the Senate and the House essentially made possible, changed the conversation. Over the past summer, I was part of several discussions that were not public by different groups that are engaged in the commemoration of genocides and the Holocaust, or by different government officials in Europe and elsewhere and beyond. And a lot of these conversations were about thinking about how we can move in a different direction. You have countries like the UK, for instance, where this is a strong conversation that's happening right now. We have countries like the State of Israel, where you have, again, a more renewed effort to push for acknowledgement and recognition, and as well as in other countries as well. So I say that there is that international dimension as well. Ultimately, though, let me say this. Unfortunately, again, this was an effort that very much required tremendous solidarity between different groups, different actors, different organizations that commemorate and fight against genocide and mass violence. This was also often, Sarah, these actions are driven, unfortunately, only by initially the targeted group, right? No government just sits around and says, I wonder which genocide we should recognize today, or which injustice we should pursue, right? You need to have the groups that have been targeted and victimized and massacred, right? First, find that time to breathe and reconstitute and rebuild their communities. And sometimes it takes 1, 2, 3 generations. Same is true with the Holocaust, same is true with the Herero genocide and other cases. And then you have these communities to actually advocate and push for some sense of justice. So in that sense, this is a process where, again, at its core, you have this struggle. So the first people that I thought about when Biden acknowledged Armenian genocide were those who in the 1950s and 60s were protesting and demonstrating on the streets with none of this, not even an inkling of this, within the realm of the possibility. None of this, including the hundreds of books on the Armenian genocide that are being published today in Turkey, the hundreds of journalists and intellectuals in Turkey who were talking about, none of this was an option, was a possibility, was their wildest dreams. And I do think that this is also very empowering in the here and now. At a time when the Armenian community is going perhaps through, in fact, I wouldn't even say perhaps, certainly through the most difficult and challenging time in its history since the Armenian genocide. To think about it this way, to approach this way, right? This is a period from, in the aftermath of the Armenian genocide, you had the generation of the Khatchig Mouradians and Elma Santorians, who rebuilt the Armenian communities in the diaspora. You have the generation that established the First Republic of Armenia, which became Sovietized and is now the independent Armenia. So from the darkest moments, and this book tells that story as well, right? Some of the most tremendous actions may emerge. But that is a decision that we have to make as a community of, as the Armenian community, as a community of activists, as a community of citizens who want to push for justice and truth.
And we stand in solidarity with you and hope that, as you were just saying, during this incredible time of darkness and challenge and violence and for some despair, I hope you find those moments of light and the community finds that network to rebuild and renew and come away from it stronger than before. Khatchig, every time I hear you speak, I learn more and I come away just inspired and just grateful that you're out there doing this work and weaving these tapestries and documenting this history. I'm just so grateful to you, and I'm grateful to our community who came to hear you speak. And for anyone who missed the start of this or missed portions of it, don't worry, we'll be putting a recording up. And for those who have not yet purchased the book, you will have an opportunity to do so and receive a signed copy if you do so in the next 2 days. We'll send out that link tomorrow. And until then, just take care, be well. Khatchig, thank you again. This was tremendous.
Thank you. Thank you for making this happen. And thank you for everyone who joined. Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.